Hey church, welcome and thank you for worshiping with us. Wherever you're worshiping, in your home or on your TV, laptop or phone, you are a part of this family. And you could watch or listen to past messages by heading to mycornerstone.family. On our sermons page, you can view playlists, search for past messages, and more. You can even listen to our content by subscribing to the Cornerstone America's podcast, which can be found on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts. I hope you enjoy the message and thank you for being a part of the Cornerstone family. Moving on into our series, we're in a series that we started last week called Believe. And we're going through the 7 miracles found in the Gospel of John. And so John kind of writes his gospel around 7 miracles. He's got a specific purpose for these miracles. Don't forget that we have a reading plan for the Gospel of John. It's only about 3 chapters a week. Very easy to just put into whatever reading plan you're doing. It's great to sit down and read it yourself or read it with some friends, family, or your kids. Remember on Wednesday night, the kids are going through the 7 I ams of Jesus. So you can tie the 7 miracles with the 7 I ams and just kind of bring it together in a home reading plan. Great to do with the family and friends. So you do that. Okay, so remember, John is writing this book on for purpose. And today we're talking about believe when the wine runs out. Okay, the wine runs out, and they just keep believing Jesus, and he fixes the issue. But last week we started by going to the back of the book, Gospel of John, and John gives us the reason why he wrote. So let's just review that real quick before we move on. John chapter 20, verse 30 says, Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. Notice that John uses the word signs. He doesn't use miracles. He doesn't use wonders. He doesn't use works of power or mighty works. He uses the word signs because he wants us to know that each of these miracles that he's writing about, and although Jesus did a ton of other stuff, he's writing specifically about these because there's something about these that he wants us to understand. That they point to Jesus and who he is, but there's also some great practical lessons that we can pull out of them and apply to our lives. So he's writing these on purpose. Under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, he's pulling these 7 out to make a point about. So Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. Verse 31 says, but these are written that you may believe. And he has a certain reason for writing about these miracles so that we would move on to believing that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. But believing is not the end in and of itself, but that by believing we may have life in his name. That is the goal. Our believing to move us to a place of life in his name, to experiencing God's presence in our life or God's will in our life or experiencing his will for our life. And so that is the purpose. And so John goes through these 7 miracles, wrapping the teachings and other things that Jesus did in with these. So we have signs, believe, should lead to life, right? And so all through the Gospel of John, we see people either believing and moving closer to Jesus, or because of the signs, they reject him and move further away. So it's a great read as you look at it in those terms. And of course, we have the 7 miracles listed here on my next slide of the 7 miracles that we will be looking at as we move through this series. So let's get into the first one. Jesus turns water into wine. Let's read our text, then we'll jump in and start pulling it apart. John chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. On the 3rd day, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine." "Woman, why do you involve me?" Jesus replied, "My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water." So they filled them to the brim. Then he told them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet." They did so. And the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. He did not realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. Then he called the bridegroom aside and said, "Everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best till now." What Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. So stay right here for a second. Notice how this story ends, is that John lets us know that this was the first of the signs. Or if you read in the New King James, it was the beginning of signs that Jesus did. See, we believe that Jesus didn't do any miracles or signs until he was baptized and the Holy Spirit descended on him, giving him the power to do these signs and wonders. And so what's interesting, we have some old documents where people have written about Jesus doing miracles as a child. And one of the cases that's written is that some boys, along with Jesus, had made some pigeons out of dirt. And one boy said to the others that mine's better than yours. So Jesus turned his dirt pigeon into a real pigeon. It flew away, and he proved that his pigeon was greater than all the others. Great story, maybe. Not true, though. There's not a lot of credibility. That's not authoritative. But there are some that have written and said that he did miracles before the time, but there's no accounts of that in the gospel, and so we don't consider that authoritative. And so, but this is the beginning of signs. This is the first miracle that he did. He makes it very clear that this is the first one that he did. All right, so we're talking about believing when the wine runs out. That's what we're going to talk about, his first miracle. And as we get into verses 1 and 2, let's jump back to verses 1 and 2. He says, on the third day, a wedding took place in Cana. Now, let's stop with this third day because this becomes very interesting. What John does here in the beginning of his gospel is he tracks through Jesus' first week. This becomes very interesting. Go to my next slide. There we go. All right, so what we have is John, the Apostle John, tracking through Jesus' first week. And in John chapter 1, verse 19, he talks about day one when John the Baptist recognized who he was and was kind of given testimony about that. On day 2, found in verse 29, John the Baptist again points out Jesus is the Lamb of God. And then John chapter 1, verse 35, day 3, John introduces Andrew and John to Jesus. And then John 1:43, day 4, Jesus goes and finds Philip, and Philip finds Nathanael. Says on the next day, Jesus decided to go to Galilee, talks about that. And then John chapter 2, verse 1, where we are, says 3 days later. So if we're keeping track of the days, which John wants us to keep track of the days, that's why he's putting these here, it's 7 days. Now this is very interesting. So John's gospel opens with the first week of Jesus' ministry. It ends with the last week of Jesus' ministry, his death on the cross, burial, resurrection. Interesting enough, John is also paralleling Genesis. Remember, John's gospel, as does Genesis, starts in the beginning. In Genesis, it gives us the first week of creation. John gives us the first week of Jesus' ministry. So there's a lot of correlations here. Very interesting how John tracks this first week of Jesus. Very, very interesting that he does this. So it starts with the first week of Jesus' ministry and ends with the last week of Jesus' ministry. So going back to John chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, it says, on the third day, a wedding took place, right? Here in Cana of Galilee, Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. So let's not miss the point here that Jesus is at a wedding. He's at this marriage celebration. When you think about this, Jesus at this point in John's gospel has about 5 or 6 disciples that he's already gathered around him, not the full 12 at this point yet. So he's gathered approximately about half of his disciples around him, and he only has about 3.5 years, right, to train these guys, to teach these guys, to take the gospel into all the world. You would think he would have a lot on his mind, a busy schedule for these guys, and yet one of the first things he does is he takes them to a wedding. He takes them to a party. This becomes very, very interesting. And I think it gives some validity to weddings. His attendance shows the value of, I think, normal experiences of life. I think his attendance affirms the importance of marriage and joy and community. I think his attendance is also very symbolic of our union with Christ. We think of a marriage as being one of the closest relationships we can have. And yet Jesus came to give us a relationship with God that would mirror that relationship in a sense. John 17, verse 3, Jesus says this, and this is eternal life, that they may know you. And if you want to boil eternal life down to its simplest definition or simplest component, it is simply knowing Jesus. It's knowing God. And in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 31 and 32, we have marriage being compared to our relationship with God. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This is a great mystery, but I speak concerning Christ and the church. It's very interesting that his first miracle is at a wedding. Now, a few things we need to understand about Eastern weddings, different from Western weddings. In Western weddings, the bride is the center of attention, right? The groom kind of slips in from the side. And as soon as the bride shows up at the back, everybody turns around, they stand, and eyes are on her. She comes in. It's really about her. But in an Eastern wedding, it's really about the guy. And so much of the celebration would be at his house or at his parents' house, and they would celebrate for a very long time. It would last about a week. So think about having to feed people, not just for one meal, but all week long. Enough to eat, enough to drink. Honestly, I don't know how they did it. I got 3 girls. Thank God we don't do it like that here, I don't know what I would do. But anyway, so that's how their feast was. Of course, the community helped out and the family helped out. And they gathered around, but nonetheless, they were celebrating and feasting for about 7 days. But there's a crisis that happens in this wedding celebration in verse 3. And when the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine." We have a crisis at the wedding, and this was very bad at a Jewish wedding, especially years ago. It was an embarrassment, a huge embarrassment for this hosting family to run out of food or to run out of wine, to run out of, supplies, and yet they did. And so it reflects very bad on them. And so we have Jesus' mom coming to him and saying, "They have no more wine." And verse 4 and 5 says, "Woman, why do you involve me?" Jesus replied, "My hour has not yet come." His mother said to his servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now this becomes very interesting. It also, I think, becomes a little hard to understand what is actually happening here. And of course, you have Jesus bring in, "My hour has not come," relating it to his death, burial, resurrection, right? He's on a time frame. If you read the Gospel of John closely, it's multiple times, about 5 times, it says that his time had not come or his time had arrived. And so it's very much about timing. Jesus was on a timetable set by the Father. But nonetheless, they run out of wine, and Jesus' response is, "Woman, why do you involve me?" And maybe coming from our culture, our society, it seems kind of rude for him to say this, but this was not culturally rude in his day to say, "Woman, why do you involve me?" It's more like, "Ma'am," or, "young lady," or "lady." So it was appropriate to address his mother like this. In fact, when he was on the cross, he also addressed his mother the same way. And so it was typical for them. So he says, "Woman, why do you involve me?" And Jesus replied, "My hour has not yet come." And then his mother said to his servants, "Do whatever he tells you." So Mary has some faith working here, but what does it mean? What does this exchange? Because it almost, like, you could take this apart, and some people believe that Mary comes and says, "Hey, basically, I want you to do this miracle." Jesus says, "No, I can't do it because my time's not here." And then she basically forces him to do it, and she tells the servants to do whatever he tells you. So it's almost like Mary is forcing his first miracle. That's one way to understand it. The other way to understand it is that Mary makes a request, and then she submits to Jesus. Jesus replies, she submits, and just tells the servants to do whatever he tells you, and she has no idea what that may be, what he's going to do. I think that's a better reading of this. And of course, you go to my next slide, there's a couple ways to understand, like, what did Mary, what was she expecting when she asked that question? And we don't know. The text doesn't tell us. We can jump to a couple conclusions. Maybe, right, I put question marks after these because we're not sure. Maybe she was looking to Jesus as just a practical help. He's the head of the family, so to speak, the oldest child. Maybe she relied on him for answers to problems, solutions to problems. And so maybe she was just calling on him for help. That's possible, a practical help. Jesus, maybe go find some more foods, find some more wine somewhere. Maybe she was expecting a supernatural solution. We don't know. That's a possibility. We could throw that one out there. She obviously knew who Jesus was, although he hadn't worked any miracles yet, but she knew he wasn't ordinary and probably had an idea of some of the things that were coming. Although she probably still had maybe a wrong concept of how everything was going to end, right? Her idea of Jesus might have been just as many of the others were, that the Messiah was going to come and set up a military, campaign in a sense, and overthrow the Romans and rule like King David. So she may have been asking for a supernatural solution, but that supernatural solution may have been geared more towards what the Jews were thinking primarily at that time was some sort of Messiah like King David. Or maybe a public display of his identity. Maybe that he would show himself to be the Messiah at this wedding and then do something maybe miraculous or at least helpful. But we really don't know. But what we do know is I think Mary had faith, right? If we go back to the verse, if you go to my next slide. So, "Woman, why do you involve me?" And Jesus replied, "My hour's not yet come." Like, I'm on a timetable here. The Father has it. And his mother, I feel like, submits to Jesus and offers this out. His mother said to the servants, do whatever he tells you. I mean, whatever he tells you, do it. I don't know what he's going to do. I've asked him to help. I'm not sure what's going to happen here. Just do whatever. And I think this is an act of faith on her part. No matter what scenario we think she might have been going at or what she meant by this, nonetheless, I think it's submitting to Jesus, and it was an act of faith to basically call him, and the servants and say, do whatever he tells you to do. So this becomes a very, very interesting exchange between him and his mom. All right, so another thing to keep track of here as we go through this, just remember too, a wedding, they run out of wine. The miracle comes out of a simple human need. And that's where miracles typically start. Now, we don't like that. I don't know if I don't like that. I don't like to be in need. I don't like crisis like that, like run out of wine at a wedding, run out of food at a wedding, right? That's not a good thing. So I don't like things like that, right? And so we don't like that. But this is where miracles happen. This is where miracles start. When we are, in a sense, in crisis, when we are in need, and we turn to Jesus. And that's one of the perfect things that Mary shows us here, is she turned to Jesus. She invited Jesus into the problem. And that's a great lesson to take away from this miracle. Let's keep going. Verse 6, nearby stood 6 stone water pots, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. Now, there's a lot of information that John gives us just right here in this verse. So first of all, there were 6 stone water jars. This becomes interesting because 6 is known in the Bible for being the number of man. So in a sense, these water pots represent man, okay? And there's 6 of them there, all right? And then, just remember, Ezekiel said this in 36:26. He writes, I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit within you. I will take the heart of stone out of your flesh and give you a heart of flesh. So it talks about, the Old Testament talks about us having a heart of stone. The jars are made out of stone, and God removing that and putting a heart of flesh, or a new spirit, right, inside of us. So we have 6 stone water jars. So we have 6 of them. They're made out of stone. Stone stands for, right, the stony old heart that man was struggling with. They are water jars, and they're used for ceremonial cleansing. So they're used for an outside ritual that can't clean the inside, but what he's going to illustrate with this is that the cleansing from the inside is coming with the new covenant. This miracle symbolizes nothing less than the mission that Jesus was on, and that was to take our stony hearts out and to give us a new heart, a new spirit on the inside, and new life. So they were ceremonial, for ceremonial washing, and each of them held, notice, 20 to 30 gallons. You think about 20 to 30 gallons. When we think about that, I think in your refrigerator, there may be a gallon of milk. Maybe in your shed or in your garage is a 5-gallon tank of gas that you use for your mower. Maybe in your car, if it's big enough, has 20 to 30, maybe a little bit more than that, 30 gallons. These were big jars. These were big, and you fill them full, they're going to be heavy. They're going to be hard to carry. So just think about the size, the quantity, not just the quality of this wine that Jesus makes, but also the quantity of it is great. So there's a lot of symbolism going on in this verse here just by itself. All right, let's keep going to verse 7. So Jesus said to the servants, fill the jars with water. So they filled them to the brim. And I love this, and part of the story is that there's always something, when God does a miracle, it's like there's almost always something that he asks us to do. There's a step of faith, and for the servants, they were to do what Jesus told them to do, and they were to do what they could do, is grab these big jars and fill them with water, and they filled them to the brim. They didn't fill them halfway, they didn't fill them a quarter way, like, man, why are we doing this? Fill it halfway. Sometimes when God tells us to do something, when we're in a situation, we're in need, we have a tendency either to not do it because it seems too ordinary, or we do it halfway. And sometimes what we need to do is just be obedient to what God has told us to do and take that step and do it exactly the way he wants us to do it, not shortchange it, but do it. And it's in these ordinary steps of faith that also helps this miracle come about. There has to be an obedience, and that's what this is. You think about obedience to do something ordinary is a woman who crawls on her hands and knees and just touches the hem of his garment. What's the big deal of that? But it's a natural thing to touch a hem of a garment, but it's Jesus's hem, and that step of faith causes her to be healed. Or somebody who's blind that Jesus tells to go wash the mud off their eyes. A simple, ordinary act, and yet in that, God uses it as a step of faith for a miracle. So a lot of times we discard just doing ordinary things, but when God asks us to do something ordinary, sometimes it leads to the extraordinary. And so there is a step of faith that is in it for us, that we need to be obedient. Okay, so they take these jars and they fill them up. And then in verse 8, it says, then he told them, draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet. And they did so. So they get these jars, they fill them to the top, and there's still water. And so I kind of feel like the miracle happened every time they dipped out a cup. It's like more water turned into wine. I'm not sure whether the whole thing just turned to wine at once or whether it was cup by cup. It's almost like the feeding of the 5,000. It's almost like as they broke it, kept dividing it, it kept multiplying and feeding the 5,000. But nonetheless, either way it happened. But they took it and they drew some out, and then they took it to the master of the banquet. So they went and they took that step of faith, and I don't know what was going through these servants' minds, but they took the cup and they give it to him. Such a simple act, and yet God uses it to bring a miracle. Think about these servants' faith. Pretty amazing. And then in verse 9, and the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine, and he did not realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. That's very interesting, too, about these servants. These are the only ones that actually saw the miracle happen. Nobody else saw it. The disciples probably knew about it. Of course, Jesus knew about it. The guests all received the wine, so they received the benefit of the miracle, but it was the servants that saw the miracle happen. And I wonder if there's a reason behind that. I wonder, maybe we would see more miracles if we were willing to serve. Just a thought. Maybe we would see God do more things if we were willing to serve, if we would just be servants. Maybe there's a correlation between serving and seeing miracles. That willing to take what God tells us to do, whether it's service, something simple, something ordinary, and doing it, and seeing how God works in our lives or the lives of others as we just simply serve. But I think there's a correlation with the servant, and they were the only ones that saw the miracle. All right, verse 9. And the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. He did not realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. They saw it. Verses 9 and 10 says, then he called the bridegroom aside and said, everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best till now. Now there's a quality here in this wine. It's the best. There's also a quality here in what Jesus did. And I think there's another point to bring out about this miracle is that there is an abundance in God. I think there is an abundance. I sometimes feel like, and I get into this thinking too sometimes, that God's a little stingy. Anybody ever felt that maybe God was a little stingy? Like maybe God blessed you, but it wasn't, it was small, it was little. Maybe you've seen little things, not big things. And sometimes our mentality, I think, can be that God does small things, but he doesn't do big things. Man, I pray about some small things, easy things, but not the big thing. That's maybe too big for God. But what we see here with the water turning wine, there was an abundance, there was plenty. And God is a God of more than enough. He is a God of abundance. And of course, the contrasting here between the Old Testament and the New Testament, the law versus grace, the old heart versus the new heart is all being compared and kind of contrasted in this story. Let's go to verse 11. What Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of his signs through which he revealed his glory. And notice here that his disciples believed in him. This miracle resulted in his disciples believing in him. We have, again, this theme of belief in the Gospel of John, and we're seeing it here, how they believed in him, his first sign. All right, so let's talk for a few minutes here. How does this miracle specifically point to Jesus? Well, I think there's two ways that it pointed to Jesus. First, it was a miracle of creation, that he turned the water into wine. And he's showing his disciples, he's showing those around, that he is the creator. As John is kind of mimicking Genesis, he's showing that Jesus is the creator, that he is God. And it's a miracle of transformation, the water being transformed into wine. It is, God changes things. He changes water to wine. He changes our hearts from old hearts to new hearts. He changes our lives. He changes our situations. He's changed our future. He's a God who can change things that we cannot change. All right, so that's how it points to Jesus. And the disciples probably got this, and they put their faith in, they believed Jesus is who he said he was. Let's talk about a couple other applications that I think are worth bringing back up here. First of all, I think we see that Jesus cares about our needs. We have wine at a wedding. Surely there are more important things for Jesus to do. But Jesus cares about our needs, whether they're big or whether they're small. He wants to be involved in our lives. I don't know what you're going through today. It may be something big, it may be something small, but nonetheless, Jesus cares about our needs. That's why God has numbered all the hairs on our head. Now, for some of us, that's harder than others. But nonetheless, he's numbered them all. Why did he number them all? Because that shows that he cares. He has that much interest. When you have interest in somebody, when you care about somebody, you know the details of their life. God knows the details of our life. He knows what we're going through. Jesus cares about our needs. A second application here, Jesus transforms the ordinary into extraordinary. He takes the water and he transforms it into wine. He takes our stone hearts and makes them soft. He makes them new. He transforms the ordinary into the extraordinary. And we see this over and over in the Gospels and throughout the Scripture. A third thing we see here, application, what does it mean for us? That Jesus brings joy. Wine is a sign of joy, and Jesus brings joy. This world offers a temporary happiness, a temporary joy, but Jesus' joy is everlasting. It does not end. And the next one here, Jesus saves the best for last. Jesus saves the best for last. It's the opposite. The world works the opposite way. They throw out the best first and then save it gets worse as it goes, right? A lot of things we've gotten into, and you can probably identify with this, you've gotten into thinking it was great up front, and then the more you did it, the worse it got, right? A lot of times the world, it starts out really good, and then it leads to bad. But Jesus gives his best is last. That it's good at the start, but it keeps getting better. Your life is good now, but keep following Jesus, it will get better. Your future is brighter. When we get to heaven, life is going to be even better. He saved the best for last. The best of our life is ahead of us. That's a good lesson to pull out of this. All right, let's go. Let's talk about the people in this miracle. Some lessons from the people in the story become very interesting. Mary shows us the importance of turning to Jesus. She shows us the importance of inviting Jesus into our problem. And maybe this is a big one for us. Maybe as Americans, we like to struggle in our own strength and our own ability, our own power. But we need to be good at inviting Jesus into our problems, inviting him into our daily life, into our situation. And Mary shows us the importance of simply inviting him in and trusting him. She brought the problem to Jesus instead of trying to fix it herself. The lesson, the best thing we can do in any situation is bring Jesus into the middle of it and trust him through it. A second thing here is the servants show us the blessing of obedience, the power in serving. I believe there is power in serving, and they show that to us. When we walk in obedience, we position ourselves to see God work in our lives in unexpected ways. I think there's just a power, and that's a great lesson that we learn from the servants. All right, how about the next one here, the disciples? Or the steward and the guests show us the joy in receiving. Man, they were receiving the blessing of God, what Jesus had done, the miracle that he did. So the stewards and the guests, they show us the joy of receiving. And here's the lesson really, if we remain in the presence of Jesus, we experience his goodness. Because they were in the presence of Jesus, they experienced his goodness. Whether they didn't know where the wine had come from, we may not know where the blessings necessarily come from, but we know this, that when we remain in his presence, God, we continue to experience his goodness. And then number 4 here, the disciples show us how faith grows, that they saw Jesus work. They acknowledged, they saw his work, and it deepened their faith. And I think when we recognize Jesus' work in our life, we take some time to evaluate what he's doing in our life, it deepens our faith in him. Our faith gets stronger. We recognize him for who he is in our life, and it deepens our faith. All right, one last takeaway here, and this one is going to take me just a few minutes to kind of unpack, but go to my next slide. what becomes very interesting as we look from the Old Testament to the New Testament, what had happened with the Jews to what Jesus was doing in the midst of the Jews. When the Passover was initially started in the Old Testament, in Exodus 12:11, it says this, and God's given instructions how to do the Passover. He says, "And thus you shall eat it with a belt around your waist and your sandals on your feet and your staff in your hand. So you shall eat it in haste." And notice here, it is the Lord's Passover. Now, whose Passover is it? It's the Lord's Passover, yeah. But here's what happened. As the Jews went on, I think the Passover didn't belong to the Lord anymore. If you go to my next verse. So this is John. This is right after the text that we've been looking at here today. It says, "Now the Passover of the Jews." It doesn't say the Lord's Passover. It says the Passover of the Jews. So like initially God set it up, this is the Lord's Passover. But over time it became not the Lord's Passover, but it became the Passover of the Jews. It became just a ritual. It just became something they did. It had lost its true meaning. It had lost its power. And so I think this is where the Jews were, and this directly ties into the running out of wine at the wedding. This is symbolizing that Judaism had run out of joy. That Judaism had run out of wine because they took what God had initiated and started, and they had veered off the course and made it more about a ritual than a relationship. And so Judaism, this is like symbolic, Judaism had run out of joy. And how many know this can happen to us as we take what God has given us, and when it becomes more about ritual and maybe going through the motions rather than relationship, when it becomes more about following a rule than it is about relationship, we lose joy. And this can happen over and over in our lives, situation by situation. So this is a thought this morning. Have you run out of joy? What have you run out of joy? If your joy has run out, we need to look to Jesus because we're working more out of rules, regulations, rituals, going through the motions than we are out of a relationship. If your faith feels dry, Jesus offers new life and transformation. Who are we looking at? Are we just following rules, rituals, law, or are we in relationship? Relationship with Jesus brings joy. It brings peace. But for Judaism, they had moved away from that, and the joy had run out. We need to make sure that we've not run out of joy. If we've run out of joy, it's not because Jesus has run out of joy or he's run out of peace, but it's because we're relying on our own human efforts rather than relying on him. Will you stand with me this morning as we get ready to close in prayer? What does your joy tank look like? What does your faith tank look like? What does your peace tank look like? Is it full? Is it half? Have we moved from relationship into just rules and rituals and going through the motions? Or are we still just in a relationship with Jesus, walking with him? Because it's in the relationship is where the joy is. It's in the relationship where the peace is. It's in the relationship where he works and he moves and he changes us and he transforms us. And when we find ourselves stuck and not changing, maybe we focus more on rules and regulations and rituals and going through motions rather on a relationship with him. Something happens to us when we just get around him. And we get around him through prayer. We get around him through hanging around with other Jesus followers. We get around him through reading his word. Something happens when we get around him. We become like him. And he changes us. And we don't, we try to figure that out. How does that work? I don't exactly know. But somehow, in his presence, our lives change. The Jews had walked away from his presence. Let that be a reminder today for us not to walk away from his presence, but to follow him the best we know how and receive what he has for us and live in the joy and the peace and the direction that he has.